There are times in history where the world seems to be reaching its breaking point. The 1960s was no exception. The era is famous for its heated politics, social victories, and also the tragedies that cursed the decade. Hello, Professor Iacobazzo and fellow EN 274 colleagues. My name is Alexander Andronescu, and I'm going to talk to you about one of the most famous, silent but powerful men of the civil rights movement. The man, the legend, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. His background and achievements are the epitome of the American dream. His passion for the American justice system and his endurance would make him the first black Supreme Court Justice in the history of the United States. Thurgood Marshall was born into a middle-class family in Baltimore, Maryland on July 2nd, 1908, 2 days before Independence Day. Marshall's mother was a prominent school teacher and his father was a railroad employee, a well-compensated occupation during the early 20th century. The young Marshall enjoyed trips to the courthouse with his father, where they would watch trials. Marshall would later confess this was one of the things that inspired him to get involved with the criminal justice system. As a boy, Marshall was often described as a model student, and at the same time, a troublemaker who liked to associate with a less than reputable crowd. His frequent shenanigans in school earned him a punishment that included being forced to memorize the Constitution in the basement of the school. Instead of resenting the text that he was forced to recite like a mantra, Marshall fell in love with the Constitution and the equality he believed it represented. In his teens, Marshall would initiate himself into the civil rights movement by desegregating a local movie theater. Marshall, along with a group of his young colleagues, sat in the whites-only section of the theater. Enraged patrons had the teenage boys thrown out of the theater and banned. This spectacle in his youth was a direct display of how exactly separate is not, in fact, equal. Marshall's pursuit of a higher education began in 1925 when he started school at Lincoln University, his second choice. His first choice was the University of Maryland. However, his application was discarded due to his race. During his early college years, Marshall was described as a party man and a prankster, being suspended twice. Then he met Vivian Buster, a fellow college student who inspired him to work harder. The two married in 1929, just before graduation. Marshall then attended Howard University, where he met Charles Hamilton Houston, dean of the law school and devout civil rights activist. Houston would mentor the young Marshall in law as well as the tactics of the civil rights movement. Graduating from Howard University with a degree in law, he began working as a lawyer for the local chapter of the NAACP, earning him the title the Little Man's Lawyer. At the young age of 27, Thurgood Marshall presented his first case before the Supreme Court. He was suing the University of Maryland for discrimination against Donald Murray, a black man who wanted to attend their law school. The case was particularly important to Marshall as he had been denied his right to attend the university based on race as well. Marshall won the case and introduced integration into the University of Maryland. This was just the beginning of the cases he would bring before the Supreme Court. In all, Marshall would present 32 and win 29. In early 1940, Marshall and his wife Vivian moved to Harlem, New York, where he worked as the head of the local NAACP's legal division, along with a few other lawyers. Because of the extensive amount of cases, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was created in order to help pay for a lot of the Americans who were trying to fight for equality. Marshall was charged with heading the fund because of his devotion to the civil rights movement. Marshall found himself traveling all throughout the country. Through death threats and nervous travels, he fought for equality from town to town across America. Marshall was a humorous man who was known for his joyous personality at parties. He also delivered speeches with a comical side to them. However, one of the speeches he delivered stood out particularly because of his seriousness. On July 13, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, Marshall delivered a speech to the NAACP Wartime Commission. The speech was called "The Legal Attack to Secure the Civil Rights." Although the speech was never recorded, his tone could be identified just by reading it. The serious words he used forced the audience to understand the situation Black Americans were facing in the country. Black soldiers were returning home and treated terribly by Americans all throughout the country, despite serving the country they loved so much. The speech called for closer involvement of the NAACP and for Americans to report any forms of discrimination to the local NAACP. The technique of using the American system to overthrow Jim Crow laws would become the greatest weapon Marshall possessed. Of the 32 cases Marshall brought before the Supreme Court, one of the most famous was Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Marshall pled that segregation of schools disfavored black students and limited their education. Therefore, Marshall said, separate is not in fact equal. His opposition was segregationist lawyer John W. Davis, who had already fought more than 150 cases before the Supreme Court. The first hearing was held in 1952. However, they were to reconvene in 1954 for the court's decision. On May 17, 1954, reporters surrounded the courthouse waiting for the court's decision. After a long speech was delivered on behalf of the Supreme Court, the decision was announced. They had ruled unanimously that the 1896 decision of Plessy versus Ferguson had no place in America, and separate but equal was unconstitutional. It was reported that the audience on either side of the case gasped in disbelief. This was the beginning of the end for the Jim Crow era. Marshall's celebration was cut short, however, when his wife, Vivian Buster, died of cancer. Close friends of Marshall would later divulge the fact that the devastated lawyer threw himself into his work as a distraction from his broken heart. As a result of Brown versus Board of Education, schools across the country were forced to integrate. But not everyone was so willing. There are countless stories about the crimes against black students who simply wanted to attend an integrated school. But perhaps the most famous example is the Little Rock Nine. 9 black students who were required National Guard protection simply just to go to their high school in Arkansas. Marshall visited the school during the heat of the conflict to assure the students that they had the support from everyone in the NAACP community. The students said to reporters that Thurgood Marshall's presence made the room calm. In 1961, Marshall was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals by President John F. Kennedy. He would be fighting cases for the U.S. government now. Just 4 years later, he was appointed Solicitor General by President Lyndon Johnson. He was praised by Secretary of State Robert Kennedy for his education and passion for the Constitution, saying Marshall would make one of the best Solicitor Generals this nation had ever seen. In 1967, Thurgood Marshall was appointed as Supreme Court Justice, the first African-American Supreme Court Justice in American history. Marshall served the Supreme Court as a liberal minority in what he called a conservative majority. He served until 1991 when he resigned due to his age. Marshall held a press conference just days after his announcement where he explained he felt that he was too old and too sickly to continue serving the Supreme Court to the best of his ability. Just 3 days after the inauguration of President Bill Clinton in January of 1993, Thurgood Marshall died at the age of 86. His funeral was held in Washington, D.C., and was attended by presidents, dignitaries, and over 18,000 people who came to pay their respects to the great civil rights leader. Thurgood Marshall changed the American system by using the American system. He truly loved the law and the Constitution. His devotion to the rights of every American were unrelenting, and his endurance in the face of danger is inspiring. He guided a generation of Americans to fight for change and still keep the country they loved. Marshall fought valiantly for civil rights, and although my generation would never see him in action, we will forever be grateful to this American patriot who played a major role in the fight for equality.